The internet as we know it depends on Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. It's no exaggeration to say that Section 230 is one of the most important pieces of legislation in the history of the internet. But if it's so crucial, why do so many people want to change it or just kill it outright? In this episode, I'm joined by Malena Dailey, a technology policy analyst at the Progressive Policy Institute, and also by Shoshana Weissmann, digital director and a policy fellow at the R Street Institute. And today's podcast is on Section 230. What exactly does Section 230 say and do, and why is it so important for the internet to function? What would happen if it was changed? And who specifically is so mad at Section 230, and why are they so angry? As always, if you enjoy the podcast, please like and subscribe and rate us on whichever podcast service you use. If you want to support the podcast, you can do so at patreon.com/Neoliberal Podcast. You can also become a member of the Center for New Liberalism at cnliberalism.org/become a member. Thank you for listening and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Neoliberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and my guests today are Malena Dailey and Shoshana Weissmann. Malena, Shoshana, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, so we've got to jump into this, and I guess the first question we should address is, what the heck is a Section 230, and why do we care about it? This is going to be one of those podcasts where you can tell we're getting deep into some real nerdy territory, because we're not even talking about a concept, or we're not we're talking about immigration, or we're talking about the minimum wage. We're not even talking about a specific bill. We're talking about Section 230, subsection C, subsection 1 says that, we're getting real deep into some piece of legislation. So why do we care about this really technical subsection of a particular bill, and what does it mean? What is it? Why are we talking about it?
Yeah, I can kind of get into what exactly Section 230 is. It's definitely an in the weeds topic, but I think the people that are excited about Section 230 love to get in the weeds on it. So happy to kind of introduce it. So Section 230 is referring to Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act of 1996. And it's kind of the law that protects online platforms from legal liability for third-party content, right? So it essentially says two things: that one, if a third-party person is posting on a website, that the company or, individual that's hosting that website is not liable or treated as a publisher or speaker of that third-party content. And then also the second part of it is that any action taken by that online platform to restrict content, take things down, things that they consider, obscene or, violent content, that they can take those things down without being treated as a publisher or speaker.
Yeah, and I'll add into that, that I think people also think this was custom made for Facebook or custom made for Twitter. But like Malena said, 1996, we had Prodigy. I didn't never use it, and I think AOL was a thing then. So it applies from everyone from Twitter, not stuff that Twitter posts on its own platform, but stuff that you post on Twitter's platform. And it also applies to your mom's blog if some crazy people or some normal people write comments in it. So your mom's not liable if they somehow post illegal content in there, which happens.
So I normally think about this in terms of slander or whatever, because slander is illegal. There's a legal definition of it. And let's say that I'm talking about Shoshana, for instance, and I say, I write something slanderous about Shoshana on the internet. And I say oh, Shoshana has a shrine of Donald Trump in her closet, and she, prays to it every night or something. And this is slander. It's not true or whatever. And if that's the case, then what you're saying is, if I post that on the internet, it's me, the individual, who's liable, and not whatever website I posted it on. That's kind of the purpose of what we're talking about here.
Yeah. And one thing I'll add too is that like sometimes people are like, oh, why can't they just take down all that illegal content? Why shouldn't it be on them? And I think even if you think that they should be responsible for other people's speech, which I think is kind of a dubious notion, like if you take it a step further, how do they know it's illegal? How do they know I don't have a shrine of Donald Trump in my closet? Like I totally might. And what you're saying might be true. But
whoa, hold on there, Shoshana.
but I might, and this actually gets to the case that created Section 230. So there had been a lot of weird case law kind of holding, platforms accountable for other people's speech in various ways, going back to bookstores, thinking through that dilemma because you don't always know what's in the book you're selling. So there was a case, and this is going to sound fake, but it's real. You can Google it. The Wolf of Wall Street sued Prodigy and a guy who posted a comment on Prodigy saying that Stratton Oakmont was like fraud. It's all fake. It's all like they're idiots and they're defrauding people. So Stratton Oakmont sued them in court and said, hey, this is libel. You can't call us frauds. They don't have any information about any of this. Like they're making this up.
Stratton Oakmont being the famous Wall Street entity that the Wolf of Wall Street was part of, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So they sued them in court and they said, hey, Prodigy, you say you keep your platform family friendly. This isn't family friendly. And because you moderate content. So shouldn't you have known about this piece of content? So the judge is like, yeah, shouldn't you have known about this one piece of content on your whole platform? And they were liable. So, that guy was obviously a whistleblower. Like we now know the Wolf of Wall Street. There's a reason he's called that. Like it's bad. And, after that, Ron Wyden and, Chris Cox came together. Chris Cox was in the House and Ron Wyden is still in the Senate, a Republican and a Democrat. And they're like, this is a pretty bad, setup where if you try to keep your platform safe and miss one piece of content, you're liable in court. Like that's nuts. So they added in Section 230 into the Communications Decency Act. And if you think about it in that context too, it protects whistleblowers because stuff that whistleblowers say can sometimes sound like libel, but you don't know what the truth is. There's no way for the platform to know whether or not Stratton Oakmont is fraud. There's no way to know if I have a Trump shrine in my closet. There's a reason that this kind of stuff goes to courts and forcing these platforms to be brilliant and psychic about all of this stuff is just it's not reasonable. They can't be the judge and juries for, a million things every day, let alone your mom one thing, on her platform on, each day. That's not something that any human being can do. So because of that, it allows lots of free speech, lots of debate, and, frauds can't sue people for complaining about them.
Just even in the context of that too, for a very nascent internet in 1996, it's really what we know now is the internet is built off this liability protection, right? Because what we interact with now on every website, whether it's, again, your mom's blog or Twitter, it's all very reliant on being able to put out your own content, your own words. Would not have really happened if they were obviously liable for those kind of things, right?
Well, let's think about why we think this, because for some people, they're going to have this instinct. Newspapers publish every day, but they are expected to really carefully fact check what they publish. If you're the New York Times or even the Cleveland paper or some small town paper, you have to say what you're publishing has to be true in order to be published. And you take it very seriously. So why aren't we holding, websites to the same standard?
I think that's an interesting point because I think you can make that comparison with newspapers. I think you can make the same thing with broadcast. It's the things that are going out on those kind of mediums are all going through an approval process, right? Versus when you put something out on the internet, it's not. And there's a reason that is able to happen. That's one of the risks of kind of toying with Section 230 and the way it currently stands is that the ability to put third-party content on the internet without any sort of approval process will be at risk. And, maybe there are people that say okay, the internet should be more of a model similar to, that of broadcasting or that of a newspaper where everything is going through an approval process. But the way that things are right now with, the enormous economy that has kind of come up through like online creators and just the reliance that people have at this point on, online search, those kind of things, it would really, really fundamentally change something that we are very used to in a way that I don't think would be beneficial.
Yeah, agreed. And it's just like, people post stuff all the time on the internet. There are literally like millions of posts that go up a day. There's just no way to fact check all of that. If these platforms don't say, hey, we edited this, we reviewed it. But if they were to, if they took a hand in it and said, hey, we're going to like review everything and confirm everything, that's a little bit different when there's that level of ownership and review. But if they're like looking and trying to keep the platform safe and they like don't know if a random guy is lying, there's no reason that the person interested in litigating shouldn't just go after the person saying the thing. A lot of times going after the platform, it's like publicity stuff. It's culture war, or it's, various levels of like, oh, I was harmed by a big entity. And it's like, no, you were harmed by one guy, not the whole entity. Stuff like that.
I mean, you go where the money is, right? The lawsuits go after the money. And Ted, the QAnon conspiracy theorist from Alaska, probably doesn't have a lot of money, but YouTube might have a lot of money. So
yeah, YouTube, I'm sure, has a lot of money. Like, I'd be down for some of that money.
All right, so we're all getting together to sue YouTube. That's the conclusion of this podcast. Okay, so there's a second part of Section 230 that I learned about when I was researching this that I guess doesn't get quite as much play, but I think is also potentially equally important. And that is that beyond just, being able to not be sued for third-party content, it actually protects you if you do want to moderate content as well.
Exactly. And that gets into the kind of what I was saying before, that like, you're not assumed to know the legality of every piece of content just because you try to keep your platform safe. And that was kind of the outcome of Stratton Oakmont case, where it was like, oh, well, this isn't family friendly, this one piece of content. And moderating content, regardless of Section 230, is First Amendment protected speech. Like, moderating content is speech. A lot of the issues people have with Section 230 are really issues with the First Amendment. If Section 230 didn't exist, the right to moderate content would still be protected. You could just be sued a lot more. But I think that's important too. To me, I guess I think I might be alone in this, but I always see the whole of Section 230 as kind of just a unifying thing. Like, you can moderate content, you can keep stuff up, take it down, whatever you're doing here, you're not liable for other people's stuff.
So this has been a topic that's been bouncing around for a while, and we're going to get into the politics of this in just a little bit. We're going to get into who talks about this, why they're yelling about it, who's really mad. But before we get into the political actors, why is this relevant right now? Why are we talking about it today? There's a couple court cases that are coming through. Can you tell me about the court cases that are working their way up to the Supreme Court and who the parties are involved and kind of what the concepts are there? Sure.
The Supreme Court has agreed to hear two cases that have to do with Section 230, and specifically whether Section 230 covers algorithmic recommendations by social media platforms. So the big one is Gonzalez v. Google, which is there's a family that is suing Google for there was ISIS content that was being recommended on YouTube, and they are seeking damages under the Anti-Terrorism Act because of the recommendation of that content. And essentially, if the court is to disagree with or side against Google in this case, that would go against, the Section 230 liability protections for, recommending this type of content, and puts into question whether the algorithms themselves are protected, which gets into a whole bunch of other issues of, where does the line draw in terms of what algorithms are acceptable versus are algorithms, which ones are being treated as publishers or speakers or versus just being what you see when you search something on YouTube.
Yeah. So like the way I understand Section 230 is that even if ISIS uploads something clearly illegal to YouTube, like a video of somebody getting beheaded or something, it's terrible, but YouTube can't be sued for that. Other than maybe, like, there are actually some specific anti-terrorism rules. But let's leave those aside and say it's some other kind of horrible content or whatever. But you can't be sued just for having the video. But the question is, can they be sued for recommending the video if it goes through their algorithm? Which, there's like a billion things uploaded to YouTube every single day.
Yeah, and I'll just add in there, too, that I think people don't understand how algorithms work. Like, people legitimately think that, like, these platforms are recommending evil, bad content intentionally because it gets interaction. But it's not. It's not good for the platform. Like, they try to fight it. And there's this great piece, I want to say it was on the Wall Street Journal, that showed how Facebook tried to chill out their content. Like, they tried to recommend content that was, like, calmer and that was, like, not political even. And people hated it. Like, people just absolutely hated it. They're like, oh man, I'm not seeing anything I want. My voice is being suppressed. So Facebook's like, all right, we didn't intend that. And somehow in that, even worse content got recommended. So sometimes even when you think, you're making it work, you're doing it the right thing, and you're like promoting more positive, better content realistically for people, it doesn't work. Because you have to remember that a lot of what plays into the algorithm is, stuff that people already like. So if people like really bad stuff, it's going to show them really bad stuff. And no matter how much you try to combat that, it's just really hard to do. You can suppress certain kinds of content through the algorithm, but people will still keep finding a way. It's kind of like, how growing up, especially if you might use certain code words with your friends in order to get around like your parents' eye so that your parents wouldn't know you were talking about like alcohol or something like that, or stuff that your parents wouldn't want you to do. It's a similar thing. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't try to make algorithms better. I'm just saying that it's something that like Mike Masnick at Tector often refers to as the nerd harder problem. Like, oh, these nerds just need to nerd harder and then like we can fix this. And I think a lot of people's understanding of algorithms is basically that.
One of the things that strikes me when we talk about algorithms is that you can't live without an algorithm. Sometimes people just act like it's an option you can turn off. But even if you literally try to turn off, in air quotes, the algorithm, you still have to serve content to people somehow. Like, which tweets does Twitter show you? Even if it's just, well, show me all of the latest tweets in, time, date, order from the people I follow, that is a form of algorithm. Even if you're on YouTube and they're just say, we have no recommendations, we're just going to show you the fire hose of new videos that were uploaded 1 second ago. That's a form of algorithm. That's a decision that YouTube has made. There's only one screen on your computer. There's only so many videos that will fit on that one screen that you can look at a time. They have to choose something to be at the top of the list, right? No matter how they choose it, whether it's a really complicated algorithm or whether it's just, let's do it in alphabetical order, there's a decision being made somewhere. And like, for some reason, it just bugs me that people think like, oh, there's some neutral way to make that decision that is actually fair to everyone. When, there is no neutral way to like, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is something that drives me crazy. The way that we talk about algorithms in the policy space is not the same as the way that they talk about algorithms in the actual, coding, more technological space. Because here, in DC, we're talking about algorithms and people are more than likely talking about, what content's being recommended to people and like what, these programs that people are using that are data driven to recommend content. But when you're coding something, anything is an algorithm, right? Like the chronological feed, that's an algorithm too. So a lot of lawmakers will throw out there like, we need to stop the use of algorithms on online platforms because, it's censoring our speech or it's, shadow banning us, things like that. And but you're exactly right that they have to make a conscious decision somewhere, no matter what, because you have to code in an algorithm to show content somehow. And, suddenly if you make your entire feed chronological, and then somebody still uploads an ISIS video and it gets put at the top of your feed because it was the most recent thing that was uploaded, does that make you liable because you, assuming that the Supreme Court case results in this kind of, exception to 230, but would that make you liable for recommending that content first, despite the fact that it's just because of a chronological feed? Like, to what level do you need to be making decisions at that point to assume liability or be a publisher of content? I just think that that's a distinction that would need to be made, because algorithms as a word does not make that distinction. And I don't know that the policy folks are having that discussion at all.
Yeah, and I'll jump in, echoing all of that basically. And I've read legislation that bans all algorithms, all time ordered, and even the ones that, it's really stressful. And I'm like, you guys don't understand how this works. And I want to cry and just, fold up and just, oh my gosh. But even let's go beyond.
And let's be honest, nobody wants that. Nobody really wants that. Nobody says, when I'm looking at Google search results, I just want the most recent, Google
oh my
search
gosh,
results.
could you imagine?
I want an alphabetical listing of all the web pages that mention cats. That nobody actually wants this. Nobody wants their YouTube recommendations to just be, give me the 1,000 videos that were uploaded in the last 3 seconds. So
that's what policy people are saying that they do, though. And I'm like, you don't understand the implications of what this means.
Yeah, exactly. And and even if you, and I'll tie it back into the terrorism angle, but I'll start kind of at the little angle. Okay, time ordered, we're good with that. Well, okay, what about by location? A lot of bills ban it by stuff like location. Well, when I'm looking for stuff, usually I want stuff that's near me. If I'm not ordering it from Amazon, if I'm like, hey, I wonder if there's a good bakery around here, and I'm typing stuff in, and then they're showing me bakeries in Russia or in South America. Okay, I'm sure they're great, but they're not near me, and it doesn't really help my current predicament. Or, a great example is Instagram. I like following the Mountain West and certain kinds of mountains, and Instagram knows that and shows me the kind of mountains I like. If they weren't allowed to show me the kind of stuff I like, then I would just it would be hot people, which is what's on a lot of people's Instagrams, or or nail tips or hair tips or makeup tips. And I'm like, okay, these are great, but I like hiking. So it's not virtuous. It's useless at that point. And then again, if you get into the terrorist angle, that kind of content, a lot of times people will seek it out. It's bad, but it's people forget that without algorithms, you can still find content. You can still look for that content. And there has been a lot of evidence that what people think is the algorithms doing is stuff that just would have basically happened the same if they had to look for it on their own and dig through content to find that it's unfortunately, and it's awful, but that's the kind of content that those people were looking for, and they wanted to get it anyway. And even with the algorithm recommendation, there's, algorithms are free speech. They're speech, and they're, it's protected speech. There can be things in the algorithm itself that aren't protected, just like any other kind of content. You can do stuff in a way that it's not protected. But at base, algorithms are free speech. So you have to have a really high bar to regulate it. And I think that most legislation doesn't seem to meet that. And it doesn't, again, so none of this means that we shouldn't be trying to do better, that platforms shouldn't be held to a higher standard by the public, that we shouldn't demand that they keep working at this and trying to make it better. But I don't think that policymakers understand that this is kind of a moral panic. It's just the latest thing that is upsetting people, and that people can blame about stuff. Remember in the 90s when there were those social media hearings about what was effectively 7 pixels. You have 7 pixels and it's well, this is corrupting our youth. I worry that I see a lot of those same signs when we talk about, 230 and a lot of things, but especially algorithms.
Yeah. And I just want to add to that. When we're talking about, liability for really dangerous content, terrorist content, those kind of things on YouTube, it's not to say that there should be those kind of things on the websites. Obviously, they should be making an active effort to take it down. And largely they are. A lot of these cases And a lot of the criticisms are in situations where the content is being taken down relatively quickly, but because there is so much content being uploaded to a lot of these websites at any given point in time, it's not always possible to get rid of those things immediately. Maybe it's up for a couple minutes, maybe it's up for an hour, maybe it's up for a week. But it's not, we can always do better, but it's not that none of the effort is being made.
Yeah, no,
so,
totally.
Yeah, I think that's an important distinction.
I said like 1 billion, hours of video earlier. I think the actual statistic for YouTube, for instance, I think it's something like 400 hours of video are uploaded every minute.
Yeah, it's something similar to that.
And that it's an insane amount. It is a fire hose of information that just never turns off. And so, I guess you can have two approaches to this. Number one, you can say just that shouldn't exist. That's one approach you can take, I guess. I wouldn't agree with that, but you can say everything should be regulated, everything should be moderated, so YouTube just can't exist in its current form. Or you can say YouTube is protected and they don't have to, they're not going to be held liable for this fire hose. But I don't know, that's the second approach. And even with the fact that they're not technically liable for it in a lot of ways, they do a lot of stuff. They make a pretty heroic effort to try to sift through that 400 hours of video that gets uploaded every single minute, using whatever AI systems and algorithms and humans they have. And I know they try to take down stuff that's evil and repugnant imperfectly, but I think a lot of people don't realize the scale of the challenge of like how many tweets are going out per minute, how many hours of video are uploaded per minute, and just the impossibility of actually getting to everything. And I sound like a shill for big tech here, but it's the truth, I think.
No, I agree. And it's really funny because I had tweeted out once explaining the scale of the content, just how much is uploaded. And people said I was lying. And I'm like, why would I lie about this? But it's really an impossible scale to get through. And I agree. And I do tend to like what the platforms are doing. I'm not saying they're perfect by any means. And I think there's a lot more to do, but it's an evolving threat. And I'll give you an example to show how it evolves. So years ago on Twitter, I used to get a lot of spam DMs and scammer DMs being like, hello, my dear. And I would talk with them to figure out what they wanted from me. Usually it was to get me off onto an encrypted app, usually like getting my bank info or some other level of personal information. But I wanted to figure out how they were doing it. So at first they would do everything just on Twitter, like itself. And then Twitter started setting up filters, and you could figure out that they like knew at a certain point that these people weren't like a sweet grandmother or someone who spoke another language and just weren't sure how to communicate in English very easily.
Shoshana, I do have to say you have the weirdest hobbies, but
I know, I really do. I absolutely do. I love talking. It's so interesting talking with scammers. But they were able to figure out at a certain point, these people are trying to scam you. So at a certain point, it would be cut off. And lately, I hardly get any of these. It's been a little more since Elon took over, but it's like not that much more. But then, back then, they would change the way they talked about things in order to get by filters. And that's just natural. Threats evolve. But that also means that it's not like, oh, they can, wave their magic wand and all these different kinds of illegal content and scams can be taken off the platform. The threats will evolve. They'll change their posting style. They'll change what they're doing so that it misses the filters. It's kind of like I was saying earlier, how kids try to talk about stuff in a way that their parents won't always realize. So again, I think that they need to improve, especially when I've caught stuff. I'm like, guys, this has to come down. But other times I figured out how they got through. Even as horrible as it is with child exploitation, I was doing media monitoring for a guy who was very famous with a very generic name. So I got a lot of false positives. And in there, I saw a picture of a kid at the beach. And it just struck me wrong. Why is this anonymous account tweeting a photo of a kid in a swimsuit? And I looked through the profile and it was random images and then a kid in a swimsuit. Random images, kid in a swimsuit. And I figured out, okay, I know what this is. So I reported it to Twitter, but I also clicked through a little more, and that account led to child exploitation accounts. And it was only images. It was very little stuff that you could filter for besides the images. So I just reported to them, showing them, here's how it seems like they might be getting around your guys' filters. And it's horrible, but it was interesting to learn how that works and how they're trying to get by those filters, whether it's scammers, whether it's the exploitation. And, they need to improve, but there's a lot of different challenges with it. Like even with exploitation, a lot of the ways they find it is, user reports and their own monitoring, but also hashing the images to other images to see if they can find the same ones. And they're not allowed to keep the images very long, which makes the hashes expire, so they can't keep finding the same images, which is a little bit frustrating. And I think there's been legislation to expand the amount of time they can keep it. That way they can keep finding more of it. But it's a really deep, evolving challenge, and it seems insurmountable at times. And again, I'm not saying they can't improve. I'm not saying they shouldn't try to improve. But I don't think the challenge is as easy as a lot of people think it is. It's really, really big.
All right, so we're all in favor of Section 230 here. It seems like we're kind of in agreement that Section 230 is important. Websites should not be sued for third-party content. We seem in agreement on that. We all seem to think algorithms are misunderstood. They're good. They help build the modern internet. This is a AI rights support group right here. We're all pro-algorithm. But it is going to be in front of the Supreme Court. And one of the questions is, what is the court going to do? There's normally you can kind of reason these things out. For instance, just use another politically charged thing. When Roe v. Wade was overturned, like people saw that coming many, many years in advance. It was not like this great surprise that it happened. A lot of times with Supreme Court cases, you can kind of read the tea leaves of what might happen. So one of the questions I have naturally then is what's going to happen here? Do we have any inclination how the different justices are going to rule about Section 230 and whether or not it applies to algorithms or whether there's protection for algorithmic choices that websites make? Shoshana, I know you are a Supreme Court watcher sometimes. Do you know what's going to happen here or what it seems like might happen here?
Yeah, I'm not sure. And I think a lot of people are unsure, oddly enough, mostly about the liberal justices. I'm not sure where a lot of them stand. And it's really interesting because the chips don't fall like I think they might in a lot of speech cases. Justice Thomas has been dying to chip away at 230. He wrote this I think it was a concurrence a dissent from a denial of cert. And he just had this long screed about maybe they should be common carriers. Maybe platforms should be common carriers. And I'm like, no one asked about this. You don't need to do this.
Well, and see, this is a difference you and I have, where I think you're more optimistic on the Supreme Court. I tend to think the Supreme Court is actually pretty culture war-y within a legal context. They stick with, they are all highly educated lawyers, but they are culture warriors as well, a lot of them. And so it does not surprise me in the least that Justice, Clarence Thomas is succumbing to weird right-wing media theories of being mad at tech companies, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I know I'm an optimist here, but he used to be my favorite justice before Gorsuch, but he's really
that is a very hot take for the Neoliberal Podcast.
I know. But I liked his speech stuff, and this really upsets me because he used to be such a free speech guy, and this is crappy to me and makes me sad. So I think Thomas is going to get away with what he can, unfortunately, and it really upsets me. Kavanaugh has had some opinions, if I recall, when he was on the circuit courts, kind of defending 230 and really showing he understood it. It might have been because it's binding precedent. He's a big precedent guy, very much like an institutionalist. So he might be okay, but it's hard to know. Same with Barrett. There was something similar to that effect. With the liberal justices, I'm not so sure. I just don't know where their minds are. I've seen a little bit from them, but not a ton. And then with Gorsuch, that's going to be I know this sounds very dorky, and it is, but if he rules wrong here, if he YOLOs on this, I'm going to be devastated because he the Gorsuch I know and love, loves unenumerated rights and like loves the Ninth Amendment. We even talked about it once and I like cried. And like everything about what he's done should show that he's into this. But if he goes the Thomas way, I will be like devastated. So I hope he knows like no pressure, but we're all counting on you just for like hope in society and stuff. But Malena might have more and other too intel.
Yeah, I think this is just such a hard one to predict because in theory, and, you know, if you're just kind of looking at this from a more objective standpoint, it really is, it's a speech issue. It's an issue with a lot of precedent, but it also is at this point so politically charged for such different purposes. And even, you know, aside from, you know, the judicial angle in Congress, it's an issue that divides both Democrats and Republicans. There's people that really are calling for 230 reform for completely different reasons on both sides. So from a culture war kind of standpoint, it's also really not a cut and dry, like liberal versus conservative type of issue. So it's one of those that I'm not really sure how it's going to pan out.
Well, let's actually jump into that then, Malena. Maybe you can start us off here because we've been hinting that this is political for a while. I think it's time to jump into that pool. This is a political podcast. We have a point of view, you know, so let's stop hiding that. There are a lot of people who are super mad at 230. Can you give us kind of just the basic overview? Who's mad at 230 and why?
Everyone is mad at 230 to some degree. But I think from a, you know, more liberal standpoint, it's a lot of people that are worried about online misinformation. They're worried about, you know, the type of content that's being put on platforms. And so they're really worried more about that. You know, I think this is where we were talking about earlier, you know, Section 230 gets divided into two parts and maybe it is one big whole, but I think that this is kind of where it does split into two different things. Because if you're coming from a lot of the more, you know, the Democrats in Congress, they're more worried about the fact that these platforms are not being treated as the publishers of this content and are thus like not taking on the level of responsibility that they think they should be for things like COVID misinformation or, you know, other things that they see as being harmful to society as a whole. You know, which is fair. I think that where that gets misguided is blaming Section 230 as being the what's going to fix that instead of something more targeted. But that's kind of the perspective there. And then on the other side, there's a lot more concern about that kind of other part of Section 230 that allows the restriction of content, which is where you're seeing like the state laws in Texas and Florida that are, you know, banning websites from taking down content that's, you know, politically aligned or for, you know, viewpoint discrimination, as they're saying. But they're more worried about like conservative censorship.
So if I summarize here, because nobody cares about principles when you reach a certain level of politics. Nobody cares about the abstract principle. Not really. Right. What they care about is what happens, what is going to result from this. And so if I summarize in a very crude way, Democrats are mad, especially like very progressive Democrats are mad that Twitter is not liable for like COVID misinformation or election denial or QAnon stuff. They view all of that as a really, really bad problem. And the fact that it can be posted on Twitter and nothing happens to Twitter makes them super mad. Conservatives are mad that essentially Facebook and Twitter can ban their accounts if they say stuff that the Facebook and Twitter think is horrible. And so they don't want their accounts banned. That basically seems like the motivation here. Am I wrong? Have I exaggerated this, or that's basically it?
Yeah, I think that's what it comes down to for a lot of people. And the thing is, both of those things are resulting in a lot of people like crying out, reform Section 230, repeal Section 230. But at the end of the day, I don't think people are really thinking about what that would actually do for either of those problems. Because if you don't have Section 230 and you are posting things that can be construed as contributing to something like a January 6th or, you know, these like QAnon conspiracies, and then the platform is held liable for it, they're not going to want any of that on their website. Like, I don't understand a lot of times from the right how that doesn't result in more censorship versus on the left, if you're getting rid of 230 and then suddenly they're not able to take down that content, you're running into the same issue. I think some of the proposals that have a little bit more weight actually try to deal with the problems that are resulting from what they view as being because of 230. But for example, in the case of like misinformation or things like that, legislation that aims at requiring, transparency and reports of like the types of content that you're moderating, processes, proving that you have processes. I think that that's a lot easier than just saying, okay, 230, let's get rid of it. And then also requiring that platforms be still taking down all of this information.
Shoshana, did you want to jump in there?
Oh, yeah. One thing I'll just add, too, is I feel like you're, like, Malena, you're right. Like, it will result in more censorship, which is insane because, I mean, you guys know me. I'm sure some of the listeners do, whether or not they like me, but I hope you like me. But I have 60-something thousand followers because I talk about regulatory reform. Like, I'm not saying every conservative has it easy online, and I'm free market. Like, free market is my thing. But, like, that's pretty cool that you can do that. So, take away Section 230 so they can't, mess with your speech rights. All right. Well, think about it this way. They're concerned most about the biggest platforms. They're not concerned about AllTrails or ZocDoc, but they should be, because if you take away Section 230, doctors with bad reviews will sue to say everything is liable. Like, I'm sure of that. Places with bad reviews, there will be no bad reviews on the internet. Everything will be like glowing, which is not great.
Like, if I say somebody overcooked my steak in a Yelp review without Section 230, somebody could come after me and sue me.
Yeah. Oh, not just sue you, but sue the platform. Like, because that's where the desire is. Because suing you, that takes a lot of time, suing every guy, but suing the platform, they're not going to allow bad reviews on you after that because they know you'll sue. Like, that's some real perverse incentives. But then getting back to the big platforms, they're going to moderate. No matter what, I think they're going to moderate. So this is actually called the moderator's dilemma. Without Section 230, and with the case we talked about where you're assumed to know about everything if you moderate, that means if you don't moderate, you're cool. You can allow the worst stuff on your platform. You can allow the worst, terrorist speech, libel all over, all this kind of stuff, and you're good. You're totally good. Like, you were assumed not to have known because you didn't moderate, but if you moderate, you're assumed to have known and be liable. So, the biggest platforms will probably
and this is just to clarify for everyone, this is kind of the all or nothing theory that either you have to moderate all the way. If you're going to do it, then you're liable,
right,
or just don't moderate and then you're not. But that's what the second part of Section 230 protects against,
exactly.
Right? The second part says you are allowed to moderate, and we're not going to come after you for XYZ thing just because you moderated something else.
Exactly. And the moderator's dilemma was the problem that existed before Section 230, which was a really bad dynamic. So figure without 230, the big platforms will probably moderate because people won't want 4chan everywhere. Like, Facebook will be 4chan, Twitter will be 4chan. Nobody's going to want that. So they'll probably want to moderate. They have teams of lawyers who can defend.
4chan probably wants that, but
yeah, 4chan might be like, no, we can compete now.
Gods of chaos. But
so every controversial piece of content they're going to want to take down. They don't know if it's liable. They don't know if they're going to want to be liable for it. So whistleblowers, just stuff that's rowdy, jokes, like they're going to have this super pristine platform, and it's going to suck. It's going to be stuff where you can't go out there and say stuff that's a little dramatic. You can't whistleblow. You can't criticize various things because the platform just won't want that kind of liability. So conservatives think that's a way to win. Like, I have some news for you because, if you criticize the Biden administration, if you criticize, businesses that you think are too woke and say stuff that isn't liable, but they might claim is liable, that's not going to be great. It's, they're just not going to want to, platforms will not want the liability for that. So the world without Section 230 is going to suck.
One of the things that strikes me is that, like, if you take this synthesis of what the progressives want and what the conservatives want here, it is essentially mandatory libel for all platforms, because what the progressives want is that if somebody posts like QAnon style misinformation, then you are liable for that, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And what the conservatives want is you cannot take something down because it has politics you disagree with. And so if you mix those two things, you must host QAnon content and you are liable for QAnon. It is it is mandatory libel if you actually mix these ideas together.
Oh, agreed. And one thing I'll add in too is, I mean, you're totally right there. But one thing I want to add in is like not wanting platforms to moderate that's in, prohibiting First Amendment speech. So conservatives are going against First Amendment activity. Their problem is not Section 230, it's the First Amendment. Even if they just want to create an environment where it's just harder to do. Well,
it's interesting because I'm not going to disagree with you in a technical sense, right? But I just want to introduce an idea here. There's a lot of people who are free speech in the sense that, like, the First Amendment protects your ability to say things. It protects your ability to not say things. It protects your ability to moderate. But a lot of people just seem to, they think of free speech as a principle more than just the First Amendment. And free speech means I get to say whatever I want, whenever I want, and you can't stop me. And if you're stopping me, that's infringing on my free speech. And like, I don't know, is there any validity to that, or is that basically just an idea we should toss out?
Yeah, I like the vibe. I like the First Amendment vibe. And the First Amendment is a vibe in addition to law, but it is not a binding vibe, which is the problem. It doesn't apply to private companies. And if people want to talk about stuff that private companies don't want to host, they can go elsewhere. They really can. And they just don't want to believe it or do it for whatever reason. But it's a good vibe, but it is not a legally binding vibe, which I think is important because the First Amendment is supposed to stop government from pressuring us to do things. And that's exactly what a lot of conservatives are doing. But then on the other side, you have the same thing just reversed. Amy Klobuchar keeps coming out with unconstitutional bills, like one's preventing health misinformation. Do you know how often the government gets health wrong? I'm not defending like a lot of the COVID denialism or anything, but like the food pyramid.
Amy Klobuchar accidentally bans the FDA.
Yeah, basically. Yeah, exactly.
Maybe be a real cool outcome for some people. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean the FDA pisses me off a lot. But like literally, the food pyramid was wrong. We got that wrong. The government gets health and science wrong all the time. And that's okay. I mean, it sucks. It's not great. But it's humans. Government's composed of humans. And I don't fault them in that. I just think they should try to control us less so that people can make their own decisions. But also, health misinformation is free speech. If I tell you fibromyalgia isn't real, I have fibromyalgia, so I can say that. But if I say fibromyalgia isn't real, like that's wrong, but that's not something that should be banned. And even though the bill says, okay, only health misinformation that, like, I forget which agency, it might have been the FDA or something, deems like that this thing is an emergency in health misinformation. But you never know what that could be. We got COVID very wrong at the beginning, which is, again, okay. I think people were trying to do the right thing in most cases and saying, Fauci saying don't wear masks. Imagine if people got like kicked off platforms by law because they said, I'm wearing a mask, I don't believe Fauci. Like that would have been really, really bad. And it's one, it's bad for free speech, but also just bad societally. So I think that that's really bad. And also the world that a lot of the left wants here, where they want these platforms where you don't have stuff that's too out there. They're liable for misinformation, stuff like that. Okay, well, you're banning whistleblowers. And if you like the Me Too movement, this really sucks for that. Could you imagine the liability on platforms for the Me Too movement? And one thing I also want to bring it back to, kind of in both cases, is that people act like all of the internet is Facebook, Twitter, Google, and it's not. I found out I had fibromyalgia because I was getting colds all the time. My doctors were super unhelpful. They didn't really believe me, even though I had like 3 diagnoses under my belt by now. So I Googled endometriosis, which I had, in getting sick all the time. I found a forum, some random forum, and it said, it talked about someone who had that, and they said, yeah, that means you probably have fibromyalgia. You should see a rheumatologist. So I did, and I did. But if that platform were liable for people giving medical information, man, they just wouldn't be there. They wouldn't host it. They'd be like, this isn't worth it. And I'm not saying don't trust authorities or anything, but be skeptical, do your own research and, think for yourself. And the internet helps us do that. People yell at Dr. Google, but Dr. Google has helped me a lot. And both the left and the right would really, really infringe on people's ability to figure out stuff for themselves. They would stop all trails from being able to function. ZocDoc would only have amazing reviews, so I wouldn't know going into a doctor's meeting if I could expect the doctor to listen to me or not, which is a big problem for women and also for people of color. You know, there's a lot to consider here that I don't think that anyone's thinking through, and it's really sad.
Yeah, and I think it is really important to emphasize just the scope of what this would impact, right? Because it is very easy to focus on the larger impacts of the like so-called big tech platforms, but really this applies to anything, right? Like, so I think the medical information is a great example, you know, but like product reviews or, you know, your local library hosting something that allows people to, you know, talk in a chat room, those kind of things. None of these things would really be possible, especially for these smaller entities that don't want to open themselves up to these larger, you know, lawsuits or things like that, without some of this protection. And I just think that that is something that people aren't even considering because a lot of this is so motivated by the hatred for tech. But the impacts are a lot more widespread and really pervasive into how people use technology. And
I mean, part of me thinks like, what about Zoom? If somebody says something libelous in a Zoom meeting, are we going to make Zoom like?
Yeah, so I had to jump in here just because this was my masterpiece as an artist. But a couple of years ago, I wrote how Jeffrey Toobin on Zoom, if you remember that, when he showed his ding dong, Zoom would have been liable for that without Section 230. Like, it's not that they would have had to be, but anyone who sued could have sued Zoom and said, Zoom, why did you let this guy show his junk on your platform?
That's a pretty incredible connection right there.
Thank you. I'm an artist.
Yeah, no, so, I mean, we're running up on time soon, but it does seem to me like I'm almost a little optimistic here because if this goes the wrong way, I almost can't imagine it going the wrong way because if you actually like break the internet in this way, it's going to be really obvious and really horrible right away. And like, it makes me think like they wouldn't dare do that and somebody will stop them. And then even if they do it, they'll have to fix it right away. And I don't know. Am I wrong to be optimistic here?
I think that for a lot of the people that I've spoken to about this, that's kind of the attitude is that, oh no, they could never change the internet in a way that's that fundamental. I think really we don't know. So that's why I think doing this podcast is important. I think people understanding what this issue is important. Because yeah, once you really get into the weeds and understand it, it becomes something that's like seems very obvious. But I don't know that it is at this point.
Yeah, and also like I'll add in addition to that I was so honored when you asked me about doing this because like neoliberal matters. Like the minds you guys are able to change is a really big deal, and PPI too. Like there's a lot of really great stuff you guys are able to do. So I'm hoping at least we can get the listeners on board, which matters because they're amazing reply guys when politicians do awful things, and that matters. But I also like, while I think people would hate the internet without 230, moral panics can really mess stuff up for a long period of time. They can scrub the internet of all the great content on it. You know, we had prohibition, like we have all these weird moral panics. We had the video game moral panic, and maybe a lot of them didn't amount to too much, but it's worth fighting because I genuinely really, really care about the free speech here. And I think that without all the voices who help out and explain and promote Section 230, we'd be in a much worse place and we might have had some really dumb laws by now.
Yeah, and I think too, just I'm Gen Z. I grew up with the internet. I think that the people that are in kind of my position cannot imagine a world where, you know, you're not able to scroll through TikTok and see not only everyone you know, but also 1,000 people you don't know. You know, YouTube, the growing up just watching people on YouTube and those kind of things. I don't think a lot of people from my generation can really even imagine what things would be without that. So I think that it's an issue that if people really understood the impact, would be a lot more fired up about.
All right, so we're going to close with our traditional final question that we always ask. Where can people go to learn more? This could be blogs, books, articles. What would you recommend for people who are interested in what we've been talking about today?
So your local library, just kidding. I would say Tech Dirt. I love Mike Masnick. Poor guy has to hear me say it a lot. He, if you like Google Tech Dirt and Section 230, you'll find a lot of really great content that covers every kind of issue. He has this one piece like you've been referred here because you're wrong about 230, and it explains a lot of like your basic Q&As when you're getting into it, or like common misconceptions. But Mike is really, really great. Follow him on Twitter. His account is locked because he's had to deal with a lot of crap, but he's really great. And if you have questions, I'm always happy to answer, but Mike is also like weirdly responsive, and it's really great. So there, and of course rstraight.org as well. But I kind of regard Mike as the king here.
I would agree with that. He has put out some great things on content moderation in general. An obligatory plug for the work PPI has done on this as well. But I think there are more and more people talking about it. And I think there are a lot of resources out there that I would recommend checking out.
All right. Well, if you are listening to this podcast on, Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever, first of all, like and subscribe. Leave us a nice review. Second of all, it probably means that Section 230 has not died yet. The platforms are still available. The content is still going out, all your beautiful content that you consume. So hopefully if you're listening to this, Section 230 still lives. We can still be optimistic about it. I want to thank my guests, Malena, Dailey, and Shoshana Weissmann. Guys, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you very much. This was great.
Thank you.